Hello, and welcome back to ATA's EconChat, ATA being the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Humphreys, and this is our weekly informal, interactive, if you want to chat about the recent week in economics, what's going on, and sometimes just interesting bits of insight that go beyond recent news. I should warn you, firstly, yes, I'm wearing glasses. That's because I'm looking at a screen that's further away from me. No mockery, please. And this will be hopefully a briefer one. I have an appointment following this live stream, so I am time constrained. With that said, let us dive in. If you are there and thereabouts in the chat rooms, in any of the places this is streaming, this is multi-streaming to the Australian Taxpayers Alliance and to my personal, both Facebook and YouTube. Wherever you are out there, please shout out, say hi. Let me know if this is coming through clearly. And if you have any questions, feel free, questions or comments, shout out as we go. We can put the comments up on the screen or if there's any questions. Or if you want to argue, that'd be great too. Or disagree, we can do a deep dive into whatever issues come up. So having said that, let us start with a new idea, which is that it's a weekly summary of economics, but I was planning on just doing specific economic topics, but I think it could be quite useful just to do a weekly reminder to some of the key econ stats. Now, of course, the one that everyone's focusing on is, as they should be focusing on, is this CPI, this Consumer Price Index. This is the change in the CPI. It's going up by 7.3%. This is what people mean when they talk about inflation. Now, of course, as many of you would know, the way the CPI has been measured has been changed through history. And it's been suggested then that this number here, the 7.3, might even be an underestimate. But notwithstanding that, this is the official number we've got. The GDP, the total output of the country, and this is the GDP growth. So how much the total output grows in the last quarter, so about 1%. A crucial thing to note here, by the way, is this is total GDP. What really matters is GDP per capita. Right? So what really matters here is GDP per person, because of course, where is it? I'll come and join you again. Because of course, if you just increase GDP by increasing the number of people in a country, you're not really getting much richer. So the important thing to note there is GDP was actually growing by 0.4% once you adjust for the growth in population. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Unemployment remains low. It's actually ducked down again, 3.4%, great stat. And average weekly earnings, that doesn't show you the change. So that's not a very useful stat here. But I thought it would be useful for us all just to keep an eye on this. By the way, one of the implications, this stubbornly high inflation rate, is that you should expect interest rates to keep going up. There has been some murmur about the possibility of the RBA taking a pause. Now, I can't predict the future. I don't know what the RBA will do. They should not do that, though. This inflation rate is far too high. They need to keep increasing interest rates. The Reserve Bank's interest rates at the moment are 2.85%. December, they should increase them again by another 25 basis points, which would take us up to 3.1%. And you'd imagine that's going to keep getting higher into the new year. So apologies for the bad news on the interest rate front, but that is what we can expect. The markets, by the way, are predicting that interest rates will keep going up to about 3.75%. So factor that in. Homeowners out there, anyone with debt, factor that in. Yes, indeed. Tim makes the point, GDP numbers include government spending. Seems like cheating. Well, you couldn't not include the government spending, but it does make it very hard to assess. In the private market, you only count GDP if somebody has chosen to buy that product, right? So we know that someone got value because they chose to spend money to buy the product. So in the private sector, we know GDP adds value. The difficulty is in the government sector. We simply include how much the government spends, regardless of whether the government adds value or not. So the government could spend their money really wisely. And if they did, then that'd be appropriate. You should include it in GDP. Or they could just burn it, right? They could spend it all on white elephants. It could be useless. And either way, it's included in the GDP stats. So I take your point, Tim. I think it's probably too cynical to say it should never be included, but it is. It's also warped to say that it should always be included, regardless of how effective it is. But there is no better system, right? I mean, GDP is a very imperfect statistic. Look, this wasn't what I was planning on talking about, but it could be worthwhile the detour. I often get to this when I'm lecturing about any topic. Some topics always come back. GDP is a very imperfect statistic because it includes things that it shouldn't, and it doesn't include things it should. Right? So if you wanted to measure the total prosperity of a country, you would not want to measure, like, you are not getting richer if you spend more money fixing things that you broke. But GDP does measure that, right? If you spend money fixing things that you broke, GDP measures that as an extra piece of output, but it's not a productive extra piece of output. So it measures some things that you wouldn't want to measure, and it misses other things that you would want to measure. And the most obvious one is any labor you do that's not in the traded economy. Right? So GDP only picks up value that's traded. There's lots of value out there that's not traded. Firstly, well, maybe I shouldn't say firstly, controversially, there's the black market. It obviously doesn't pick up the black market. Now, you could say the black market has no value, but that is belied by the fact that people spend billions of dollars voluntarily in the black market. Somebody's getting some sort of value out of something somewhere, and that's not captured there. The grey market is not captured. The grey market, the sort of people are running a legitimate business, but they might not report all of their cash earnings. That's not captured, but it still contributes towards prosperity. And the big one is the work you do in the home, right? So here's a weird little factoid about the way GDP is measured. If you had two families living next door to each other, and each of those families were looking after their own kids, then the work you put into looking after your kids, not counted in GDP. If now both of those families decide to pay each other to look after their kids, so I go to my neighbor and say, I'll pay you $10 to look after my kids. They come to me and they say they'll pay me $10 to look after their kids. If we do that transaction, or those two transactions, GDP has gone up. You'll notice there's no more kids being looked after. There's no more anything of benefit except that you're swapping who's looking after the kids, but it went from not being included in value to being included in value. So there's a couple of ways that GDP is a very imperfect measure of benefit to society, of well-being. Having said all of that, some people take that lesson, there's a lot of truth there, and they take that lesson and assume we should just throw away GDP as a statistic, that it has no value. And that is also a big mistake. So taking GDP too literally, pursuing what's being called GDPism, only taking actions focused on how to change GDP, that is a mistake. But throwing away the statistic is also a mistake. It's an imperfect statistic, but we need to use something to measure the size of the economy. And even if we're only measuring the size of the economy as traded, regardless of its value, that's still a useful thing to know. Just because something's imperfect doesn't mean it's useless. Just because something is imperfect doesn't mean we should throw it away. So GDP, very useful statistic, but very imperfect. So we should use it, but we should always be aware of its imperfections so that we know when it's not appropriate and when it is appropriate and when we should disregard it. So thank you, Tim, for justifying that little detour and that little random rant. That wasn't what I was planning on chatting about, but it is something I enjoy chatting about. So, look, what I did want to actually, I'll go back to, what I did want to talk about was two things. One is, I've discussed briefly before, tax analysis, and the other one is the other one is the labour market reform that is currently being discussed in Parliament. So I'll start with that because this one is topical. And if you're a normal person, you perhaps haven't been overly fascinated with it, but it is something that's worth paying attention to. So I wanted to touch on it for a few reasons. So for those who may not have been paying close attention, the Labor government at a federal level is looking to push through industrial relations reform, meaning like IR labour market reform, the labour market rules. And they're doing several things, but the one point that's been quite controversial is they want to introduce a system where unions can negotiate simultaneously with multiple different employers at the same time. So instead of unions representing people in a workplace, and negotiating with their employer, they could collectively bargain with multiple different employers in the same industry. So they're looking to push that through, and that is raising a few eyebrows. The issue with the labour market, I'd like to take a step back on the labour market question and just look at why we have these rules in place in the first place. And it's worthwhile. A deep dive would take months, let alone hours, let alone the time we have available. So the short version is the labour market is a market, right? You are buying and selling, or somebody is buying and selling labour. So you're buying and selling people's work and you pay them. That's the price of labour, which we know is the wage, right? So we're normally the labourers. So we see the wage as an input. But if you think of it as a market, supply and demand, and you are buying, employers are buying the labour of employees. Now, how much are people going to get paid? That's the wage. Everybody wants wages to go up, right? So the nasty little lie in the political debate about labour markets is the economic left will say that the economic right want wages to go down. That's not true, and they want wages to go up. So they're the good guys, we're the bad guys. That is a very dishonest way of framing the whole discussion. Everyone wants more prosperity, and they want widely shared prosperity. Like everyone has a shared goal. The mistake some people make in politics is to assume when someone else disagrees with you, that's because they are just a bad person. Right? The old cliche that the left thinks the right is evil, the right thinks the left is wrong. So it makes more sense to think that each other are wrong rather than each other are evil. We all want what's best. We all want higher wages. The question is how to get there. And to think about how to get there, you have to understand how wages form in a market economy. And the long story short, if there is a competitive economy, and that's a big if, right? So we can come back to that if. But if there is a competitive economy, wages will trend towards what's called the marginal productivity, which means your wage will trend towards the amount of value that you bring your employer. So before you showed up to work, your employer was making $100. You showed up to work, now your employer is making $150. So you bring $50 of marginal value, or marginal product, as it's called in economics. You bring $50 of marginal product. In a competitive economy, your wage should trend towards $50. Right, so that would be that's the idea behind it. Now, why is that? Well, if your wage was below $50, then your employer is getting basically money for nothing. But if that's the case, why wouldn't another employer come in? So just say you're bringing $50 of value and your employer is paying you $30. If that's the case, any other employer could come in and offer you $40, and they've got nothing to lose, right? You bring $50 of value and they only have to pay $40. They just put $10 in their pocket. Great. But then why wouldn't another employer come in and offer you $45? This other employer has nothing to lose, right? They pay you $45, you bring $50 of value, they just pocket $5, right? So there is nothing that would stop anyone coming in and bidding that wage up to at least $49. So it'll trend towards $50. It doesn't hit exactly your marginal product every time, everywhere. It doesn't happen instantly. Time exists. Life is messy. But in a competitive market, your wage would trend up towards that marginal product. Why doesn't it go higher than the marginal product? Well, that's because if an employer was paying you more than your marginal product, they'd be losing money. So just say you bring $50 of value to your employer pays you $60, they pay you $60, you bring $50 of value, they're just losing $10. For what benefit? Or I should just assert, for no benefit. All right, so there's no incentive to pay people over their marginal product. And if they're paid below their marginal product in a competitive economy, their wage will be bid up. You'll note that in a competitive economy, there is crucial, because if there's only one employer, then who's going to bid up your wage? Which is why a competitive economy is very important. It's also why, by the way, if everyone's employed by the government or has their employment regulated by the government, that actually creates the imbalance, a massive imbalance, and workers have really no power in that situation. They have to rely on the benevolence of government, and historically, consistently, that benevolence has not been there. So be careful what you wish for, lefties. But anyway, that's where the wage comes from. And now you can see, why do unions exist, and why does sometimes the Labor government step in to try and give unions more power? Well, the first answer, there's three answers to this. And I'm going to start with the most generous answer. The first answer is sometimes with imperfect competition in the market, your wage might not be bid up to the marginal product, or it might not be bid up very quickly. It might take too long. Your wage might be stuck at $45 or $40 instead of the $50 you deserve, to use our previous example. And so if you empower unions, that improves the bargaining position of the workers, and so they can go back and push their wage up towards the marginal product quicker. Right, so that is the legitimate role, the legitimate use of bargaining and unions to help workers in an economy. Now that's a legitimate use, but it's worthwhile pausing and say, all right, if that's the benefit, because we'll get to the cost in a second, but if that's the benefit, let's scratch the surface. So who are these people who lack bargaining power? Now you have bargaining power. Yes. So who are these people that are going to be paid below their marginal product of labor? That's going to be people where there is very few employers looking for your labor. But the low income amongst us, the ones that we generally worry about the most, tend to be the unskilled. And for unskilled laborers, there's a range of different, there's not only one employer hiring unskilled people, right? There are many different employers hiring unskilled people. Actually, what you find is you have fewer employers hiring some types of skilled people, because you can have some quite niche areas of skills and niche areas of knowledge, and you might have few employers there. And if there's few employers, then you might have the problem where your wage doesn't get bid up very quickly. But then that's a little odd, right? Why are we worried at increasing the power of unions? Because we're worried about the wages. That's a nice mix, the pay and the wages of highly skilled, already highly paid people. They're only earning $200,000. That's outrageous. They should be on $300,000. That seems like a strange thing to get upset about. And the truth is, the low-paid people, there are already lots. There's thousands of different employers out there. So there already is a greater tendency in that part of the market to bid the wage back towards the marginal product. So, and it's the other point there is, if the problem of the wage being below marginal product is caused by the lack of a competitive market, the most obvious solution is to make the market more competitive, right? We identify, this is one of the big tricks to economics, and it'll come time and time again. I'm sure I'll keep coming back to it. You have to identify the problem clearly and accurately so that you can find the solution. And if there are wages that are falling behind marginal product, the problem is that there's insufficient competition in that industry or in that labor market. And if that's the problem, the solution is more competition in that industry or in that labor market. Identify the problem accurately, and that'll show you the most direct and effective solution. So first part here is, yes, there is a potentially legitimate role for empowering unions to try and boost wages to marginal product, but it's mostly helping people who don't need help, and it's not the most direct way of doing it. So it's quite ineffective on the benefit front, but it's not just benefit, there are costs as well. So what are these costs? The main thing that is really going to come here is unions don't just try to increase wages up to marginal product. They just try to increase wages, full stop. Right? So one of the consequences of giving unions more power, so more power to be able to arrange strike action against smaller businesses, more power to be able to push through higher wages on a range of businesses, some who can afford it and some can't. The consequence will be that some wages are pushed higher than marginal product. And as you remember from 10 minutes ago when we were discussing this, why would an employer continue hiring someone if their wage is pushed above marginal product? And this is why it's so crucial for labor markets. There is not a single labor market. It's so crucial that it's segmented and treated differently when it's different. Because different people are different businesses are different. Some businesses are just inherently more productive, and they'll be able to pay more. And some businesses are less productive and they simply can't. Some employees, they might look like they're doing the same job, but some will bring more productivity, more marginal product, and some will bring less. And if you introduce a one-size-fits-all in a situation like that, then that'll be fine for the efficient businesses that can afford to pay more, and for the efficient workers who can justify their employment, great, they're doing well. But for the small businesses who are less efficient, less productive, forcing them to pay more could send them to the wall, or it would mean they have to fire a few people. And for the people who are less productive, I mean, if your marginal product is 40 and the union successfully negotiates a wage increase to 50, why would your employer keep hiring you? They might do it out of benevolence. That is, don't roll your eyes. That is a thing. Some employers continue to hire people who are unproductive because they grow to like them. But long-term, that is not a strategy, just relying on the long-term benevolence of employers. Like if you push the wage above someone's marginal product, you are taking an action that is going to eventually lead to unemployment. And that is a crucial point about this whole labor market discussion, because I tell you what, I use it as a litmus test sometimes, this and a few other topics, about whether somebody wants to do good in the world or whether they just want to look like they're doing good in the world. Because there's nothing easier than to say, look, I care about poor people. I want to increase their wages. So I will just, I will ram through a policy to empower unions or increase the minimum wage, or in some places simply assert all wages are high now. And you could write that down in legislation. It doesn't make it true. Right? So it makes you look good, but does it actually fix the problem? The underlying problem, the issue, wages, if you want it to be higher, you need to increase. And I've said this at every EconChat, and I'll say it everyone into the future. What you need to increase is productivity. Because if wages move towards productivity or marginal product, then if you increase marginal product, you increase wages. That is the long-term solution. It's not a very sexy solution. It's not fun. It's not a big fancy piece of legislation. It doesn't help get someone elected, but that is the solution. These policies that empower unions to be able to drive up wages, they're theoretically being done to drive up wages when wages are short of marginal product. But as I just described, that generally isn't the case. We have a fairly competitive economy, especially in especially in the labor markets that the people we're worried the most about. So it's mostly going to drive up wages in some instances above marginal product and lead the most disadvantaged amongst us to lose their jobs. Because it's not the high productivity people that lose their jobs. It's not the high pay people. It's the people who most need their jobs. So again, it comes back to, do you want to do good in the world, or do you want to look like you're doing good in the world? And that's not an easy question, right? Because you cop a lot of flack if you're willing to say the things that don't sound right. But what's more important, looking nice or actually being nice? So I'll leave that one out. Now, the third reason this is being pushed through, I discussed the first two. The third one is quite self-evidently, this legislation is all about increasing the power of unions. So there has been a steady decrease in people joining unions when left to their own devices in an industry that's not biased by government. The rate of union membership is low and getting lower. So membership union membership is largely held up now through the public service. It's a very non-normal industry. I mean, that's not the private sector, obviously. And a few niche markets where you're basically required to. So there's some products you have to have, some insurances you have to have that you can only get through unions. So again, it's legislation is propping up union membership. Why is that? Generally, because wages do gravitate towards marginal product. Right? The whole real reason unions exist, try and push wages up to marginal product in case the market is not competitive. That reason for unions doesn't really exist in Australia. And that's why people are generally choose not to join unions, right? So they're drifting away. And this legislation is about increasing the power of unions. So if unions are able to arrange strikes across the industry through a bunch of different employers, that significantly increases their position, increases the incentive to join them, increases their ability to act, get attention. And of course, these unions are very often donors to the Labor Party, which creates an awkward little feedback loop. You donate to the party that creates the rule that increases your power. Now that's the, well, I was going to say dirty little secret. It's not even a secret. I mean, it's pretty self-evident that this legislation is designed to boost union membership and union power in the economy. And that is obviously supposed to be a means to an end. But if you are a union official, it's also an end in and of itself. And if you are a labor official reliant on union donations, it's an end in and of itself. The actual end is increasing wages. And as we discussed before, that could be good or bad, depending on if you're moving towards marginal product or over marginal product. So thus ends my rant. So, well, I was going to say thus ends my rant on labor markets. Thus ends the introduction to the issue of where wages come from. The Labor government wants to push this legislation through. It is now past the lower house. It's past the House of Representatives. This legislation that, amongst other things, would give the unions the power to negotiate with a bundle of small businesses together, not have to negotiate with them independently, but can bundle them together. It should be noted that this doesn't apply to businesses with fewer than 15 employees. But having said that, the caveat to the caveat, that's not 15 full-time employees. Right? So that's just 15. It could be 15 casuals, 15 part-time. They could only add up to 5 full-time equivalent. So these are quite small businesses still that are going to be hit. And there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, lots of small businesses hire 16 people. Right? So there is a plethora of small businesses that are going to be hit with this legislation. So that's a bit of a cheeky move. The other one, and this is to some degree hard to get around, but the other problem with this is to consider. Imagine you're a business that's growing from 5 people to 10 people to 15 people. This creates quite a built-in incentive not to grow past that 15 mark. So I would say the one quick workaround, look, I think they should just throw away that part of the legislation. But if they insisted on keeping it, how about we redefine small business up to a much higher number? 50 employees, 100 employees, something well away from what any small business that got a bit successful and did well would run into. So that could be, I doubt they're going to take my suggestions, but that would be one way of making it less bad. But anyway, so that's the caveat they gave. It doesn't apply to fewer than 15, a business with fewer than 15 employees, but it does apply to a lot of businesses. Nearly every employer you've heard of or know of or have had will be captured by this legislation. Now, that's passed through the House. It hasn't yet passed through the Senate. Now, the Senate is interesting. I should have put a graphic together for this because I understand people lose numbers very quickly when they're just spoken. I can't think of a quick solution for that, so I'll just say there are 76 senators, 76. Right, so to pass legislation, you need 39 votes. That's the magic number. So just think of that, right? 39, that's the magic number. Labor has 26, which you may notice, the astute amongst you, 26 is a lot less than 39. But the Greens have 12. Right, so the Greens have been hugely advantaged with the current voting system at the federal election. They now have 12 senators. So Labor plus the Greens together is 38. You may remember you need 39. All right, so there is a crucial extra vote out there. So who are the other senators? Well, most of them are Liberal and National. They're not supporting this, which is good. Well done to the Liberals Nationals for opposing this. So that leaves 6 more crossbench senators. Labor just needs the 1 out of those 6. So this is the politics of the economics here. Labor needs 1 out of those 6. 2 of them are One Nation, and 1 of them is UAP, Ralph Babbitt from Victoria. So the 2 One Nation and the 1 UAP senator, they're not going to go for this, or it doesn't look like it. I think they've come out against it. So that leaves Lambie. There's 2 Lambie senators now, and David Pocock. So those are the 3 senators that the Labor Party will generally rely on, or will go back to and look to if they want to pass legislation. So going into this, the assumption had been that Lambie and Pocock, the sort of quote-unquote teal senator from the ACT, so he's an ACT senator. Normally ACT gives you 1 Liberal, 1 Labor. Last election, it gave us Pocock, a teal independent, and Labor. And Pocock kind of has balance of power in the Senate, a hugely important person now. Used to play for Australia, Zimbabwe born, used to play for Australia in the rugby union team. Sorry, get that one right. Open side flanker, I think it was. And he now has balance of power in the Senate. And the interesting thing here, people had assumed Lambie and Pocock would be sympathetic to Labor legislation. They both said that they are worried about exactly what we've been discussing. This provision where unions can force a bunch of smaller businesses to accept an average one-size-fits-all solution. So they've said Lambie's been skeptical of that, and Pocock has said, I think to his credit, I think there's a few people that have shown themselves to have a bit more, a bit of integrity in this, or a bit of decency. They've said that this legislation is being rushed through too quickly, and at the very least, they need more time. They need more time to see it. They need more time to consider it. They need more time to suggest amendments. And Labor has been very unwilling to give more time. So at the moment, Labor doesn't have their 39 votes. They've got their 38 votes of Labor and the Greens, but they are 1 vote short, and Pocock and Lambie are holding out for the moment, and good on them. So let's see where that goes. So what Labor's done now is they've extended the sitting weeks to now the Senate will sit on this Friday and next Friday in the hope of creating more time to get their legislation through. I hope that Lambie and Pocock will hold strong and require this to be considered further. Right? Because this time, even if they're going to push it through, there has not been enough notice here for small businesses to get prepared. It's going to cost them thousands of dollars to even deal with this legislation, let alone the consequences, the potential strikes, the wages they might not be able to afford. So let's hope that Pocock and Lambie number 2 are able to hold strong and not pass this legislation this week and next. But that is something to keep an eye on, right? So we're in that fight right now. I understand for the Victorians amongst you, there's a bigger fight going on. And I do see this, the messages coming through here. But this is a fight that's happening in real time right now. If you can, reach out to Pocock and the Lambies, do it very politely, because at the moment they're doing the right thing anyway. You should always be polite, because being rude to politicians never actually helps you change their mind anyway, and it's not nice to be rude. But in this case, they're also doing the right thing. So if you've got the time, if you have a way to contact them, reach out to their electoral office, details all online, and encourage them to take more time on this and to think carefully about what it could do to small business. So that is a real-time fight going on in Australian politics. I had planned on diving in. Oh, actually, I might go into the tax analysis issue. Actually, no, I'm being indecisive live on air right now. No, I did want to cover 2 things, but I also wanted to keep this to half an hour. It is half an hour. I think this is a good chat worth having. This is a piece of legislation that is very live at the moment. So I'd encourage people to get out there, and thank you for that. Stomp in knowledge, the comments. Yeah, legislation is going through too quickly. Let's see if it can be paused for the moment. A question here, going back and just looking through some earlier questions that came in. Can't you decrease the supply of labor, e.g. immigration, and increase wages also? Yes, to some degree. Immigration's a much more confusing factor than it would first seem. Again, I said before, with the labor markets, there is no labor market. It's not singular. There are lots of different ones. Every different business has different internal structures, giving them different productivity levels, and every different employer has different levels of productivity. It's with immigration, it can be very different for different levels, different types of immigrants. There are types of immigrants out there that when they come into Australia, it increases the productivity in Australia and actually leads to, or it contributes to higher wages and more jobs. There are other types of immigrants that don't contribute to higher wages and more jobs. So it's very hard to just have a blanket opinion on, quote unquote, immigrants writ large. But yes, to some degree, depending on the sorts of immigrants, if you decrease the supply, you could increase wages. By the way, that reminds me of something else leading back to the issue at hand, this labor reform. One question that might be worth asking is, why is Labor in such a rush? Like, Pocock and Lambie seem genuinely willing to listen and talk it through. And they are not right-wingers or free market radicals in the slightest. If Labor has a good sort of vaguely centrist economic argument of helping people, spend your time, take your time, talk it through with them, convince them of your arguments. But Labor seems very keen to rush this through. And it's worth asking why. And I think potentially one thing to consider is, and this links back to the first thing, when we did that little overview of, we still got it here? An overview of the stats that's in the Australian economy at the moment. The tight labour market that we've seen lately is starting to put upward pressure on wages. So wages in the last quarter went up by, I think, 4.5%, which is starting to catch up and exceed the level of inflation in that quarter. It'll be interesting to see if it can sustain, but it seems likely. So this is, this is conjecture on my part, but I wonder if we are starting to see upward pressure on wages, just being a little bit cynical, but being cynical of politicians tends to be a good idea. If there's upward pressure on wages, is it possible that Labor wants to take credit for that? So if wages are trending up anyway, but Labor can rush through some piece of legislation now, they'll be able to claim that the higher wages were caused by their legislation. Whereas I suspect that what's happening is, at least while GDP sustains, that's going to start pushing wages up. And if wages were going to go up anyway, then Labor lose out. If they don't pass this legislation, they would lose out on taking the credit. So anyway, that may or may not be true, but it is worth asking why they're in such a rush. If they know it's such a good piece of legislation, sit down. It's like 300 pages. They expect everyone to read it in a couple of days. This is 300. Labor market regulation in Australia is so complex. If you truly hate someone, just buy them a copy of all labor market legislation and invite them to read it. It is not something that anyone would want to do. And even the experts, it moves quickly, and very soon there's things they don't know. So thank you. So that's giving a bit more time would make sense, and it's worth asking why they don't want to give that time. But anyway, that's conjecture. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what's in their minds and their hearts and souls, but that's one possible idea. Look, I have gone over my time now, so I am going to pack it in. I was going to say I'll check out questions, but if I've already gone over time, I shouldn't check out questions. We are back every week. Now, some people pick me up on this. I do say we're back 7 p.m. Every Tuesday. Of course, that is Queensland time. Right. So for people in other states, other time zones, Australian Eastern Standard Time is 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time, which is for New South Wales and Victoria, I think Tasmania, it's 8 p.m. And I'm sorry, South Australia and WA, you'll have to calculate the time difference yourself. I don't know that off the top of my head, but 7 p.m. Queensland time every Tuesday. I'll be in here. Feel free to come in, ask questions, have a chat. We'll talk about something topical in economics that's been going on recently, and I will often use it as an excuse to go on a rant and give a little mini economics lecture, as is my want to do sometimes. Having said all that, thank you for joining me this Tuesday. I'll see you next Tuesday, and stay well.
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget naughty. Hey DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget naughty.